Madison County, Montana, in the summer of 1886, was a country that tested everything a person built and remembered nothing they intended. The valley floors ran wide between the Tobacco Root Mountains to the east and the Highland Range to the west, and the grass grew thick and deceptive in the warm months, promising a gentleness the land had no intention of delivering once the season turned. The homesteads along the river bottoms were modest timber structures built by people who had come west with ambition and a saw and very little else. Most of those structures would stand for 5 years, some for 10. But in the summer of 1886, standing in the heat and the long light, no one was thinking about decades. They were thinking about the next winter and the one after that, and whether the walls they had raised could hold against what was coming. What none of them were thinking about, because none of them had yet seen it done, was what Nessa Calder was building on her 60-acre claim at the foot of Baldy Mountain, 3 miles south of the Virginia City Road. What Nessa Calder was building did not look like a cabin. It looked, from the road, like a monument, or a mistake. A vast rectangle of stacked stone, 4 feet high and growing, occupying a footprint that seemed absurdly large for anything a single homesteader might need, stretching roughly 28 feet long and 20 feet wide, with walls nearly 3 feet thick at the base and tapering slightly inward as they rose. The stones were river rock and field granite, gathered from the creek bed and the surrounding pasture, and Nessa had been hauling them since the snow cleared in April, dragging them on a wooden sledge behind her mule, stacking them with a precision that suggested either madness or a knowledge so specific it was indistinguishable from madness to anyone who did not share it. She worked from first light until the heat of midday drove her into shade, and then she worked again from late afternoon until the light failed and the rectangle of stone grew by inches each day, patient and enormous, and the neighbors who rode past on the Virginia City Road slowed their horses and stared and could not make sense of what they were looking at. Nessa was 34 years old. She had arrived in Madison County in the spring of 1883 with her husband, Callum Calder, and their 2 daughters, Fiona, who was then 5, and the younger girl, Moira, who had been 3. Callum had died in the winter of 1884 from pneumonia contracted during a timber hauling job in the mountains above Alder Gulch, and Nessa had buried him in the small cemetery west of Virginia City in frozen ground that took her 2 days to open. She had spent the 2 winters since his death in the small timber cabin Callum had built in their first year, a single-room structure with a stone chimney and a plank floor that let cold air rise through the gaps like something alive and unwelcome. She had survived those winters. Her children had survived those winters. But survival and warmth were not the same thing, and Nessa Calder had spent 2 Montana Februaries listening to her daughters breathe in the dark beneath every blanket she owned. And she had decided, sometime in the silence of those nights, that she was done surviving and ready to solve it. By midsummer, the stone base had become the primary subject of conversation at Farwell's trading post, 4 miles north on the Virginia City Road, and the conversation had acquired a tone that was not quite cruel, but was no longer merely curious. The consensus, arrived at gradually and then held with the comfortable certainty of people who build things for a living in hard country, was that the widow Calder had lost her practical sense somewhere in the grief of the past 2 years and was spending her summer on a folly that would leave her without a finished shelter when the cold came. The stone base was too large, it was too heavy, it was too much labor for a single woman with 2 small children and a mule, and the labor she was spending on it was labor she was not spending on firewood, on chinking, on the dozen urgent preparations that every homesteader in that valley understood were the difference between a winter endured and a winter that killed. The man who said this most clearly and with the most authority was Harlan Pruitt. Harlan Pruitt was 51 years old and had been building structures in Madison County since 1874. He had put up cabins, barns, a schoolhouse, and the front addition to the Mechanical Hotel in Virginia City. And he had earned a reputation as the man you consulted before you raised a wall if you wanted that wall standing in the spring. He was lean and deliberate, and he did not waste words. And when he spoke about construction, the men at Farwell's listened, because Harlan Pruitt had never built a structure that failed. He had ridden past Nessa Calder's claim 3 times in June and twice in July, and each time the stone base had been larger and Nessa had been on it, working, her daughters playing in the grass nearby. And each time Harlan had felt a deepening certainty that he was watching someone make a serious and possibly fatal error in the way they allocated their time. He came to her claim on a Thursday in the third week of July. He tied his horse at the fence line and walked across the grass to where Nessa was fitting a stone into the eastern wall of the base, tapping it into position with a wooden mallet, her sleeves rolled above her elbows and the dust of the stone pale on her forearms. He watched her work for a few minutes in the way that builders watch other people build, not with admiration, not with contempt, but with the analytical attention of someone who understands joints and loads and the way stone behaves under weight and weather. Then he told her she was building it wrong. Not the stonework. The stonework, he admitted, was surprisingly good. But the project itself was misconceived. The base she was building was large enough to support a structure 3 times the size of any cabin she could reasonably build on top of it, and the thickness of the walls, 3 feet at the base, was excessive to the point of waste. He told her that a proper foundation needed walls no more than 18 inches thick and a height of no more than 2 feet above grade. He told her she had already used more stone than the foundation of the schoolhouse in Virginia City, which seated 40 children. He asked her, with the directness of a man who had earned the right to be direct, what exactly she thought she was doing. Nessa set the mallet down on the top of the wall. She looked at the stone she had been working, and then at Harlan Pruitt, and she said something that he would repeat with varying degrees of bewilderment for the next 4 months. She said, "The stone is not a foundation. The stone is the warmth." Harlan looked at her. He looked at the stone base, 4 feet high, 3 feet thick, 28 feet long, 20 feet wide. He looked back at her. He said that stone was the coldest material a person could build with in a Montana winter, that he had seen stone chimneys freeze solid by January, and that a woman who believed stone would keep her warm had been given bad information by someone who did not understand Montana cold. He said this with patience and with genuine concern, and with the absolute confidence of a man who had built 40 structures in cold country. Nessa listened. She nodded once, the way she always nodded when someone told her something she had already considered and moved past. She picked up the mallet. She said, "This stone will not be cold." The story Harlan told at Farwell's trading post the following week acquired a momentum of its own. The widow Calder, it was said, was building something enormous out of stone that served no purpose anyone could identify. She had told Harlan Pruitt, who had built half the standing structures in the county, that the stone was the warmth, which was like saying the river was the fire or the wind was the roof. It did not parse. By August, the project had a name. People called it the Calder Monument, and they used the word with the affectionate condescension of people who are certain they are watching a mistake unfold in real time and feel no particular urgency to intervene, because the mistake will make its own case soon enough. What they could not see, what Harlan Pruitt could not see, because nothing in his 12 years of Montana construction had given him any reason to see it, was what Nessa Calder understood about stone and heat, and the ancient relationship between mass and temperature that her father had taught her on a sheep farm in the Scottish borders before she was 12 years old. Nessa had been born in 1852 near Jedburgh in Roxburghshire, in the valley of the River Teviot, where her father, Gregor McCrae, had managed a sheep farm on land owned by a family whose name Nessa never mentioned in Montana and did not consider relevant to anything she was building. The farmstead where she grew up was old, not decades old, centuries old. The main house had walls of dressed sandstone 2.5 feet thick, built on a base of rough-cut foundation stone that extended 3 feet below ground level, and those walls and that base had been standing since before anyone alive could say when they had been laid. The house was not warm because of its fireplace, though it had one. The house was warm because of its stone. This was the thing that Gregor McCrae understood and explained to his daughter in the patient, specific, unhurried language of a man who had grown up in the same house and had absorbed its logic through his skin before he ever learned it as a principle. The principle was thermal mass, though Gregor McCrae did not use that term. He said it this way: "Stone remembers." A thick stone wall exposed to summer sun absorbs heat slowly, deeply, into the full body of its mass, the way a river absorbs rain, not on the surface, but throughout, until the entire mass is holding temperature like a deep well holds water. When the air outside cools, the stone does not cool with it. The stone releases what it has absorbed steadily, radiating warmth back into the space it encloses at a rate determined not by the weather outside, but by the total mass of stone. A thin wall releases its stored heat in days. A thick wall, 3 feet thick, extending below ground where the earth itself provides a stable temperature floor, releases its heat across the whole of winter. The stone does not fight winter. The stone ignores it. Gregor McCrae had showed her this with his hands. In January, when the frost was hard on the Teviot Valley and the sheep were in the lower fields and the wind came off the Cheviots, carrying a cold that cut through wool and leather alike, he had placed her small palm against the interior wall of the farmhouse and asked her what she felt. She felt warmth. Not the sharp warmth of a fire, not the temporary flush of sunlight through glass. A deep, patient, even warmth that came from inside the stone itself, from the center of the wall, as if the stone were alive, as if the summer were stored inside it and leaking out slowly, faithfully, like a promise being kept over months by a material that had no capacity for breaking promises. He told her that the wall she was touching was still giving back the heat of the previous August. He told her that by March it would be cooler, but not cold, never cold, and that by April the sun would begin recharging it for the following winter. The cycle had been running for longer than anyone in the family could count. It would continue running after everyone in the family was gone. That was what stone did. That was all it had ever done. Nessa had carried this understanding across the Atlantic and then across the American continent the way you carry something that is not a memory but a physical knowledge. When she arrived in Montana and saw how people built, timber frames, thin walls, constant fire, she recognized immediately what they were missing. They were building shelters that began losing heat the moment the fire burned down. They were fighting a war of attrition against winter, and the war had no winning side, only a surviving side and a losing side. What Nessa intended to build was not a shelter. It was a reservoir. The stone base she constructed through the summer of 1886 was not a foundation in any sense that Harlan Pruitt would have recognized. It was a thermal battery. The walls were 3 feet thick because 3 feet of dense stone holds meaningful heat across a 5-month winter. The footprint was oversized because the cabin that would sit on top of it needed to be entirely enclosed within the thermal envelope. Every wall resting on stone that would radiate heat upward and inward for the duration of the cold season. The height, 4 feet above ground, with an additional 2 feet extending below grade into a trench she had dug by hand in May, gave the base a total mass that Nessa estimated at somewhere close to 40 tons of stone. 40 tons of granite and river rock absorbing the Montana summer from April to October, preparing to release it into the space above when the snow came, and every other cabin in the valley began consuming firewood at a rate their occupants tried not to think about. By the end of September, the stone base was complete. 6 feet of total height, 4 above ground and 2 below, 28 feet by 20 feet, with a gap left for a heavy plank door on the south wall and 2 small openings on the east wall sealed with oiled hide. The interior was divided into 2 rooms by a central stone wall 18 inches thick. The northern room she designated as cold storage. The southern room she filled with dried straw over the stone floor, 18 inches deep, compressed and leveled, creating an insulating layer that would prevent the ground cold from pulling heat downward out of the stone walls. The straw did not produce warmth. It prevented the warmth already stored in the stone from escaping in the wrong direction. In October, she began the cabin. It went up fast because it was small. The footprint sat entirely within the perimeter of the stone base, the log walls rising from the top of the stone course, so that the cabin appeared to be growing out of the base the way a small plant grows from a large pot, which is exactly the visual impression that had made the neighbors uneasy. The cabin was 14 feet by 18 feet, a single room with a sleeping loft above for the girls, a stone chimney on the north wall, and a plank floor laid directly on the top course of the stone base with a layer of dried moss between the planks and the stone. The chimney she built not for survival heating, but for cooking, and for the comfort of a visible flame in the evening. A small fire, enough to warm the hands, not enough to sustain life through a Montana night at 30 below zero. The stone beneath her feet would do that. She chinked the log walls with a mixture of river clay and cut straw, and she sodded the roof with 18 inches of earth and root mass. By the first week of November, the structure was complete. A small, tight, well-built log cabin sitting on top of an enormous stone base that made it look, from the Virginia City Road, like a child's playhouse placed on a table. The visual absurdity was unavoidable. She had not built for appearance. She had built for January. The first hard cold arrived on the 19th of November, 1886, and it arrived with the particular savagery that Montana produces when the Arctic air slides south without obstruction through the Great Plains corridor, pouring down from the Canadian territory as if a door had been left open somewhere north of the border, and no one was going to close it until spring. The temperature on the morning of the 20th was 11 below zero. By the 22nd, it was 19 below. By the end of the month, it had touched 26 below zero on 2 separate nights, and the firewood consumption at every homestead in the valley had doubled and then doubled again, and the sound that carried across the frozen bottomlands in the gray mornings was the sound of axes, constant, urgent, desperate, the percussion of people who were calculating in real time whether they had cut enough to survive and suspecting, with increasing certainty, that they had not. At the Pruitt homestead, 2 miles north on the Virginia City Road, Harlan was burning a cord of wood every 9 days. He had cut and stacked what he considered a generous supply, 14 cords, enough for a normal winter with margin to spare. But this was not a normal winter, and by the middle of December, he was revising his arithmetic downward with the particular tightness in his chest that comes from watching a finite resource diminish against a demand that shows no sign of relenting. His cabin was well built. His chinking was as good as anyone's in the county. His chimney drew cleanly. And still, the cold came through, patient and relentless, finding gaps he could not see, pulling heat from the living space faster than a well-maintained fire could replace it. His wife Adeline kept the children, 3 boys, the youngest only 2, close to the hearth through the day and piled blankets on them at night, and the front of the cabin, furthest from the chimney, stayed cold enough that water left in a cup on the table had a skin of ice on it by morning. At Nessa Calder's claim, at the foot of Baldy Mountain, something entirely different was happening. She had banked her fire at 9 in the evening on the first night of the hard cold and had not rebuilt it until morning. It was a calculation she'd been making since September, when she first pressed her palm against the interior wall of the stone base and felt what she had been waiting 6 months to feel. The deep, steady warmth of a Montana summer, stored in 40 tons of rock, radiating inward at a rate so slow and so constant that the air inside stayed more than 20 degrees warmer than the air outside without a single piece of firewood being burned. The stone floor of the cabin was warm to bare feet, not merely not cold, warm. The way her father's farmhouse in Roxburghshire had been warm in January. She checked the temperature inside the cabin each morning with a mercury thermometer she had purchased in Virginia City the previous spring. On the morning of the 22nd of November, when the outside air was 19 below zero, the interior of the cabin read 41 degrees Fahrenheit. On the coldest morning of November, when it touched 26 below, the interior read 38. Not warm by the standards of a well-heated parlor, but livable, survivable. Warm enough that her daughters slept under 2 blankets instead of 5. Warm enough that the water in the pitcher on the table did not freeze. Warm enough that a small fire in the morning and another in the evening, a fraction of what every other homestead in the valley was burning, brought the cabin to a temperature that was not merely endured but inhabited, a temperature in which bread could rise and clothes could dry, and children could sit at a table with their hands uncovered and eat their supper without shivering. And then the worst freeze came. The week of the 14th of January, 1887, brought the coldest temperatures recorded in Madison County in living memory. The thermometer at Farwell's trading post read 34 below zero on the morning of the 15th. On the 16th, it read 37 below. The river froze to a depth that would not fully thaw until late April. 2 horses died at the Merrick place on Alder Creek. A family named Howell, recent arrivals from Missouri, abandoned their cabin on the night of the 16th and walked 3 miles through the dark to shelter with neighbors, and the Howell children arrived with frostbite on their fingers that took weeks to heal. It was the kind of cold that does not argue. It simply demonstrates what it can do. If you have been sitting with this story, if you have been holding the image of 40 tons of stone absorbing summer and the image of Harlan Pruitt shaking his head on the Virginia City road, then what follows is the moment the story has been building toward. Stay with it just a moment longer. Harlan Pruitt came to Nessa Calder's claim on the morning of the 17th of January, 1887. The temperature that morning was 34 below zero. He came because the cold had shaken something loose in his professional certainty, and because he had been thinking about the stone base with a persistence that surprised and troubled him since November, and because a part of him, the part that had spent 12 years learning how materials behave and what structures require, needed to know whether he had been wrong. He was burning through his firewood at a rate that would leave him short by the first week of March. He was not yet desperate, but he could see desperate from where he was standing, and the widow Calder's woodpile, which he could see from the road as he passed, was barely diminished. It looked nearly the same as it had in November. It was the 17th of January, and her woodpile looked like autumn. That single fact was enough to bring him to her door. She opened it, and the warmth that came through the doorway reached him physically, a soft pressure against his face after the 34 below outside, and he stood in the threshold for a moment without moving, recalibrating something inside himself that he had been certain about for 6 months. The cabin was warm, not blazing, not stifling, an even, surrounding, almost sourceless warmth that came from everywhere at once, from the floor, from the lower walls, from the stone beneath and around, a warmth that did not depend on the fire that was burning, small and almost decorative, in the hearth on the north wall. He stepped inside. Fiona and Moira were at the table eating oatmeal. Moira's feet were bare on the plank floor. Harlan looked at the child's bare feet and then at the floor, and he did not immediately speak. He knelt, slowly, and placed his hand flat on the floor, palm down. The floor was warm. The warmth was coming from below, from the stone, from the 40 tons of granite and river rock that Nessa had spent 6 months hauling and stacking. The stone that he had told her in July was the coldest material a person could build with. The stone that was now radiating the stored heat of the previous summer into the living space above it with a patience that no fireplace he had ever built could match. He stood up. He looked at the small fire, barely more than a few sticks crossed over coals. He looked at the thermometer hanging on a nail by the door, which read 44 degrees Fahrenheit. 44 degrees with a fire that would not have warmed a dog, while outside it was 34 below zero. A difference of 78 degrees, maintained not by fuel but by mass, not by burning but by the slow release of stored energy. He said, "I told you the stone would be cold." She said, "The stone was never going to be cold. It had 6 months of summer in it." He nodded. It was a slow nod, the kind that comes not from casual agreement, but from the quiet, private rearrangement of a large number of assumptions that had been in place for a long time. He stood in her cabin for a long while, saying very little, touching the walls, looking at the floor and the fire and the children with their uncovered hands. And when he finally moved toward the door, he stopped and he shook her hand, which was not something Harlan Pruitt did often or casually. And he said that he owed her an apology for what he had said in July. And she said that he owed her nothing because he had been trying to help, and he nodded once more and walked out into the cold and untied his mare and rode back up the Virginia City road. The warmth stayed on his hand for a quarter mile. He did not speak about it at Farwell's for 3 days. When he did, he spoke with the careful, measured precision of a man correcting his own professional record in public. He said that Nessa Calder had built something he did not yet fully understand, but that he had stood inside of it on the coldest morning of the coldest winter any of them had lived through, and the floor had been warm under his bare hand, and the children had been barefoot, and the fire had been nothing, and the cabin had been 44 degrees. He said the word barefoot, and he stopped speaking for a moment, and let the word sit in the room, because the men listening had children of their own who had not taken their boots off indoors since October, and the word carried a weight that no technical explanation could have matched. The room was quiet for a time after he said it. The questions that followed were sharp and practical. How did it work? How much stone? How thick? Could it be added to an existing cabin? Harlan answered what he could, and when the questions exceeded what his single visit had shown him, he said so and told them they should ride out to the Calder place and ask the woman who built it. Several of them did. Over the following weeks, men who had spent the summer calling it the Calder Monument rode out to Nessa's claim, and she walked them through the base with the patience of someone who has been expecting to be asked. She showed them the thickness, the below-grade extension, the straw insulation on the interior floor. She explained the principle the way her father had explained it to her, not as a technique, but as a logic. Stone holds heat. Thick stone holds more. If you build enough mass and give it a summer to absorb warmth, it will carry you through the winter the way a deep lake carries a valley through a drought. The heat is already there. You are not creating it. You are keeping what the sun already gave you by storing it in a material too heavy and too dense to let it go quickly. By the following spring, 2 homesteaders in the valley had begun gathering stone for bases of their own. Neither built to the full scale of Nessa's original. One built his walls 2 feet thick, the other managed only 18 inches. But both reported, the following winter, that their cabins held temperature longer than before, that their firewood consumption was meaningfully reduced, that the floors were warmer and the mornings were less brutal. The principle scaled imperfectly, but it scaled. Mass was mass. More was better, but some was better than none, and the difference between a cabin on bare ground and a cabin on 2 feet of stone was a difference the families could feel in their hands and their feet, and in the size of the woodpile remaining when February turned to March. Harlan Pruitt spent the summer of 1887 building a stone base beneath his own cabin. He jacked the existing structure on timber supports, excavated beneath it, laid a base 3 feet thick and 3 feet high with 2 feet below grade, and lowered the cabin back onto it. It took him the better part of 4 months, and he said afterward, with the wry honesty of a man who has learned something at his own expense, that it was the hardest single project he had undertaken in 14 years of building in Montana, and the only one he wished he had started sooner. He also said, at Farwell's trading post, in front of the same men who had smiled about the Calder Monument the previous summer, that if he had understood in July of 1886 what Nessa Calder was doing, he would have been hauling stone alongside her instead of standing at her fence line telling her she was wrong. None of them smiled. None of them had reason to. Nessa Calder's stone base at the foot of Baldy Mountain stood for more than 50 years. The cabin on top of it was replaced twice, once in 1904, once in 1921, but the base itself was never rebuilt because it never needed rebuilding. Stone does not rot, it does not burn, it does not consume itself in the process of doing its work. Later, owners did not always understand why the cabin was warmer than neighboring structures. They attributed it to the chimney, or the chinking, or simple luck. The base was so fundamental to the structure's performance that it disappeared from notice the way all truly successful engineering disappears, not because it stops working, but because it works so well that no one thinks to ask why. There is something in this worth holding. Nessa Calder did not invent thermal mass. She inherited an understanding from a man who had inherited it from the house he was born in, an understanding so old it had no origin story and no name that anyone in the Teviot Valley would have thought to give it, because it was simply how things were built by people who had been building long enough to notice what worked. She carried that understanding 12,000 miles to a place where it was unknown, and she applied it in silence, and she did not stop when a man who had built 40 structures told her she was wrong. What Harlan Pruitt saw from the Virginia City Road was wasted effort, an absurdly oversized base for a modest cabin, a widow spending her summer on stone when she should have been cutting firewood. What he could not see, what no amount of building experience in Montana timber construction had prepared him to see, was that she was solving a different problem than the one he was solving. He was asking the question that every homesteader in the valley was asking: how do I burn enough fuel to push the cold back? She was asking a question that none of them had considered: how do I store enough warmth that the cold becomes irrelevant? These are not the same question. The first leads to a woodpile that shrinks every week and a fire that must never go out. The second leads to bare feet on a warm floor in January and a woodpile in March that still looks like autumn. The distance between those two questions is not a distance of intelligence. Harlan Pruitt was intelligent. He was experienced. He was better at building with timber than Nessa Calder in almost every measurable respect. But he had never placed his hand on a thick stone wall in a Scottish farmhouse in January and felt the warmth of the previous summer coming through the rock. He was working from questions that had served him well for 12 years, and those questions had a ceiling, and the ceiling was the gap between burning and storing. If this story has stayed with you, if you have felt something in the distance between what Nessa was building and what the valley saw from the road, then you may already understand what it is about. It is not about stone. It is about the things you carry from places other people have never been. The knowledge that looks like foolishness from the outside, because no one watching has been given any reason to recognize it. The preparation that looks like wasted time because its payoff lives in a season that has not yet arrived. The scale that looks like excess until the worst freeze comes and the floor's warm and the children are barefoot and the woodpile has barely been touched. What have you been building that looks, from the road, like too much? What have the Harlan Pruitts in your life told you is wrong, not from cruelty, not from ignorance, but from the honest limits of what their own experience has shown them? They are not your enemies. They are competent people working from the only questions they have ever been given. They have never stood inside your stone base with their hand on the floor. They do not know what you know. They cannot feel what you feel. And the only argument that will ever reach them is the one Nessa Calder made. Not with words, not with debate, not with explanations at the fence line in July, but with 40 tons of river rock in a Montana winter and 2 children eating oatmeal barefoot on a warm floor while the thermometer outside read 34 below zero. The cold does not negotiate. It does not wait for consensus. It does not care whether the valley understands what you are building or whether they call it a monument or a mistake. The only question that matters when the worst freeze arrives is what you placed between yourself and its arrival. Nessa Calder chose stone. She chose mass. She chose patience and scale and the slow, faithful physics of a material that everyone around her had already decided was worthless for warmth. The stone was not cold. The stone was the warmth. It had always been the warmth. Press your hand to whatever you are building and feel what is already there. The season will do the rest. If this story stirred something in you, or settled something, consider passing it along to someone who is hauling their own stone while the valley watches from the road. And if you have not yet found this channel, the subscribe button is just below. There is a story here every single day, and some of them may be waiting for exactly you. This story is a work of fiction. Nessa Calder, Harlan Pruitt, and all other characters and events depicted are entirely invented. The principle of thermal mass in stone construction is historically real and well documented. The story is not.